This is Thorin's YouTube channel. Make sure you're tuning in, hitting subscribe.
Now that the SK Gaming lineup and indeed core of the squad from the past is gone, because maybe I'll make a video on this topic sometime, like how you define the core of a team. I know what people tend to do is if 2 or 3 players stick around, they just say that they are the core, and then they continue on and they expect that you can like chart the results of all the different various lineups that this core played in. But I personally think core should actually be more in line with what the term suggests. Like, this is the most essential inner element of a team. And so personally, in the SK Gaming lineup, I think if you look in history, the core actually has to be either the 4 players of Fallen, coldzera, Fur, and Taco, or I think you could even make a case, bearing in mind, I could have seen a world in which if someone like Fur had retired in 2017, you could have taken Phelps, a player who has a similar skill set and to some degree mentality, and slotted him into that role, and there are other aggressive riflers maybe you could have brought in. I actually might even make the case in terms of like informing who SK Gaming were in terms of playing style and strengths and each of the players being at their best, that you could make a case that the core, if you want to pick 3 players, is Fallen and coldzera, clearly in-game leader, fragging in-game leader, his special AWPing style and understanding of the game, his philosophy. coldzera as the star player, the all-around ability to consistently dominate in the game. And I would actually pick Taco rather than Fur. I would say the ability he had to make a supportive core with coldzera and Fallen, to amplify coldzera's ability to create space and allow someone like Fur in the 2017 lineup to still go off and Phelps to have his own chances to frag because someone else had to do a lot of the hard lifting. I would have said that's the core. And so as far as I'm concerned, as soon as Taco left, that was the core of SK Gaming done. We're onto a different core in MiBR now. And even though they've kept Fur, Fallen, coldzera, I think you can see that they've never, with those 3 players, played in a style that was in any way reminiscent of the 2017 SK or the 2016 SK and Luminosity. They're a very different team and they've lost some of their identity, their character. So now that that core is gone, I think we can reflect back now, it was enough times past, and we can think of what was so special about that core, what was so good, what were they so uniquely excellent at, like how did they win all those championships? Because I always thought, this is a point of contention I always had, that fans really went too far overrating the individual prowess of the players in those lineups, the 2016 and the 2017 lineup, and in doing so, overlooking that while in certain cases they had some fabulous players, and in some cases some of the other more role players or lesser figures were pretty good at their roles, they didn't have all the best players. And they definitely didn't have like 3 of the best players in the world at all times. They definitely didn't have 4 of the best players in the world at any point in time. That's unreasonable. And if I was making an end of year top 20 list, I don't think I would ever put more than at max 3 SK players on there. And if you go back to 2016, I might even have just put 2 SK players on there when you consider some of the mad star talents we have on lower squads that aren't winning the championships. So to me, it was more about how they played as a unit, and it was about how they complemented each other's strengths. This was a real team that always lived up to that billing of like more than the sum of their parts. 2016 especially, because they actually had less firepower in 2016 because they didn't have Phelps and they had FNX, who was bringing a different quality than just raw firepower. So I think this was a squad that had just enough firepower in 2016 to be the best, and did it because of how cohesive they were, what a fabulous map pool they had, what a great work ethic they had, the drive that was going for them, their mentality when they faced certain opponents, like their sort of like fighter, almost an underdog spirit of like, it doesn't matter if these guys, people think they're better than us or they're really strong, like we're going to overcome them anyway. And part of that was this clutch culture that they had in their team. And part of that came, in my opinion, from elements of the core. So if you want to talk about the most clutch players this team had, I've made this point many, many times that I don't actually think that being clutch, first of all, it doesn't just apply to winning a clutch, like a 1v1 or 1v2 and being the last alive. It's also like playing well under pressure and in key situations, doing your job in key situations, or overperforming in a certain scenario in a game. Not only is that a component, but I also think that, again, this ends up with people getting overinflated value who actually weren't that clutch, but they did play on a very clutch team and were very clutch players. And sometimes that even put them in position or rubbed off on them in terms of culture and attitude that they were a little more clutch themselves than they normally would be. But you see them go elsewhere and they don't have any of those factors whatsoever. So for me, if I look at the history of the SK lineup, the really clutch players were obviously coldzera. What a fabulous player in terms of like not just a star player, but you put him in those situations, 2v2, 2v2s, 1v2s, 1v1s, and he's going to consistently do work and be a very, very strong player, especially for a star player. There actually aren't that many star players that are the absolute best clutches, and he was obviously up there. Then you've got to put Fallen in there, because actually in 2016, where he was just a very good player in general and had a really crazy all-around skill set, because he was AWPing and in-game leading, fragging, and winning clutches. 2017, when he actually had his dips in form, and at times he wasn't as good, his clutch game was still always there. He always would have a couple of amazing clutches on Train or Inferno, or deep in a game when it's that 14-14 moment, or you have to get to overtime, or he's in this wicked 1v2 where the positioning seems too good from the others. He would get those amazing clutch rounds, and he showcased that that was something that was always inherent to him as a player. And the other player, the only other player I would pick out as particularly clutch, would be the first half of 2016 and the very end of 2015 when he joined FNX, because I thought that's a thing he'd really transitioned his game into. He wasn't going to be the top fragger in the game and carry the whole game, but he could carry the game in terms of winning the 2 or 3 big clutches. And on certain maps, he had a very good feel, Inferno, Train, for how to play certain positions as CT. If you kept him alive, he had a consistent mentality, he had a lot of confidence in himself at the time, and he played around his teammates well enough that he was a particularly clutch player. You look at people like Phelps. I saw Phelps in Immortals before, and I've seen him in 100 Thieves since, and the team that later became NTC. Not a particularly clutch player, very skilled player, but no, not that clutch really when you get him outside the squad. Taco won probably way more clutches than he should have done when he was in the SK gaming team, the Luminosity gaming team, when you consider he's not like a super skilled player. So I think some of that for me was like some of it rubbed off on him and he developed their mentality. But because he's not that insanely skilled an individual player, not a super clutch player really. Bolts, I've always thought was a player where he's very up and down because he seems so plagued by confidence. Like in Immortals, when he was sometimes the best player in Immortals with Phelps, he would look pretty clutch. Then later on, when they had different players and they were playing more to the sort of aggressive Henny style of play in KNG, it didn't always look that clutch. When he was in SK, he initially was doing well. When he was buoyed up by the conference, they were winning all those initial tournaments, 3 of the 4 titles. But then later on, when he had his issues, he was anything but clutch. So to me, that shows how culture and how a certain core can create a chemistry and a way of playing that comes from some of the players, not all the players, affects some of the other players and gives you this overall effect. But then when you take some of the ingredients out, it falls away, it disappears. So even though they've still got Colds in and they've still got Fallen, are they that clutch a team? I don't think they're as clutch, quite frankly. I think that's really dropped off. I wouldn't put them up there as one of the best in the world in that respect. Obviously, they've lost many, many games that were close, many scenarios where the old SK would have come through. Now, that's one of the things that I also loved about the old SK, which they've lost now. They've lost some of their identity now. They've got some good players. They're trying to make it work in MiBR. But the ability of the old SK to, first of all, have that style of play where you run the clock down, you take not really like full map control, but you take over an area and then you make a read from that. It was almost like a hybrid between a Na'Vi and a Karrigan style of play. They were doing some of that on the fly, making good reads. They had the players who all understood how to play, so they're all on the same page. That meant that as a result, it's not that you were like switching styles, it's that your style was very adaptable. It was very adaptive. You could change what you were doing at all times because that's already the way you played the game. You could read what the opponent's doing because that's already what you're trying to do, make the correct response to what he's doing, and to make the proactive plays that make him make a response which makes him uncomfortable, where he's then going to play more passive off what you're doing and you're dictating the flow of the game. That was always fabulous to watch. That's why some of their T-sides were so exciting and you always thought anything was possible. Since everyone was on the same page, they had some of the best 2v2 and 3v3 player we've ever seen. Their ability to make a read on what to do and then how they would individually play off each other, which some of it's based on chemistry, some of it's based on playing together, some of it's based just on that extra quality of chemistry where it's just the third mind takes over the two players and is better and coordinates them in a way where they couldn't really each tell you exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it, but it syncs up so well in the same way that you see currently in the Astralis lineup, where some of those players, when they had 4 other players or when Magus was playing elsewhere, they didn't always have that same exact quality, but now it looks amazing. Now they look unstoppable. Then you've got to add in, I've already alluded to it with some of what I've just said, the insane comeback potential of this team. Because that all came for me from, yes, having clutch players, yes, having a good culture, having just enough team play, or having a lot of skill, depending on what year you're talking about, having the best player, having a fabulous in-game leader who can frag. Yeah, these are all great qualities, but I actually think it's their composure when they were in those scenarios because of those factors. I always say this, the mental follows the physical, follows reality. So what happens is you get a situation where if you're someone who, unless you're someone who is absolutely delusional, if you think you're the best and say you're the best and try to believe you're the best, but you go in the game and you get wrecked and you're not able to win things and you're not able to do what you promised you'd do and you're not able to do what you thought you'd do, unless you are absolutely delusional, in which case, by the way, you'll never make it to the top of the scene, most likely, except for some outrageous talents, you will have to then, in your mind, it will happen unconsciously, recalibrate, align yourself again with what is closer to reality and what's happening to you. And that's called losing confidence. That's called coming back down to earth. That's called just becoming a guy where it's like, yeah, we could win and I hope we have a good game. Well, we just weren't playing on our game. Like, we're having some issues at the moment. It's not that you are confident and then you play super well. Why would that work? Is that what you imagine? It's some sort of magical mind over matter type scenario. I think that's fairly implausible, actually. It seems quite unreasonable. So for me, because they had all these excellent elements of chemistry and team balance and the right kind of players and mentality and drive, then when they were in these tough situations and they'd played them out a million times in practice, and in other scenarios they'd come through in the big game and they had clutch players they could rely on for the people who weren't as clutch, then also because they had a similar philosophy and they'd worked with so much theory of the game and how they consider what you're supposed to do and what the optimal players and what are decisive players and what's a good gamble to take or what's a safe play to make, it meant that their composure for knowing, hey, we know what to do in this situation. We know how to beat these guys. We can play our game. They're going to make mistakes. We'll capitalize on those mistakes and we will get back into this game. We'll grind our way back in, or when it's an even game, we'll be the ones who get the key rounds to win the game. Or if they seem like they're coming on strong, we'll kill their hopes at the end and we'll be the ones who take the title and we'll go for. That was one of the most exciting, compelling aspects, even when at times I was kind of pulling against them. Like, I liked an Astralis team they were playing, or I liked the FaZe Clan team they were playing, whoever it might be. There was time where you couldn't help but go, fucking hell, that's amazing how they're doing that. That's one of the things I love about esports, is when you like a player and you follow them, if you do it the right way, yes, you learn that player's skill set, his strengths and weaknesses, you follow his career, the ups and downs, you get an expectation level, you want to see him win, but then when he doesn't play well, you understand that. But one of the things that should happen, I think, if you're a fair-minded person, is over time, when you initially see him losing to a rival or losing in a key moment, you might feel like, because you want him to win so much, that takes over and you go, it's bullshit, or they got lucky, and why does it never work for this guy? But if you're a reasonable person, hopefully a more mature person, and somebody who's seen a lot of games over the years, hopefully what happens is in time, even if you didn't like the opponent or the rival beating your team that you're talking about, you start to get an appreciation for how fucking amazing your team is, and as a result, what that team's doing to shut them down, or to overcome them, or to beat this player who might be better than them at the moment. And eventually, you have to initially maybe begrudgingly tip your hat, but in time, you actually grow to love the other team and that quality to how they do it. So I was someone, when I used to watch tennis, I used to love Roger Federer, his shot making, his raw ability, but as a result, the amount of respect I have for Rafael Nadal, for Novak Djokovic, is unbelievable, because that these guys could stop him winning, that they could actually outlast him and outgrind him and put him in bad situations where the best player ever, the most skilled player ever, had to go to some of his worst shots. The amount of respect I have is insane. Likewise, I was never that huge a fan of Jaedong initially in StarCraft Brood War. I was more a fan of Bisu and Flash. But to see him get better career accomplishments than to beat Flash again and again when Flash looked like in a random Pro League game like the best player in the entire world, maybe the best player ever, the amount of respect I had grew and grew and grew to where now, like, okay, Flash and Bisu were maybe my favourite players, but like right below them is Jaedong. Like, that's how high up he's gone, above some of the other players I also liked to really watch, who were fabulous players themselves, but I didn't have the same kind of connection to because of appreciating their quality. So it's one thing I always appreciate about the SK guys, and that combat composure is so rare in Counter-Strike history. Like, some of the greatest teams of all time have it, but not all of them actually. Some of them didn't necessarily have that composure. So you think of this, and funnily enough, that tends to be a quality which makes for great Counter-Strike games. The ability to come back, to have this composure in a match, to win the opponent's pick when your pick's being won by them in surprising fashion, to never be mentally broken in that way. That's the catalyst for really great matches, epic rivalries. So we think of some of the teams who did have that quality. We're talking about the original NIP core. We're talking about Virtus Pro, that classic 5-man lineup. We're talking about this SK Gaming lineup, and in fact, particularly the 2016 one, the 2017 one had that element as well, even though they also had a lot more firepower. So I always thought they could get out of trouble a little bit more than the 2016 one could, where the 2016 one had to rely on that clutch ability and composure under pressure. That means when you have that component, you can match up with anyone. You can even match up with someone who's in insane form, someone whose composition of players seems like they should counter you. They should be able to beat you. I mean, FaZe Clan in 2017 is a great example of this. They seemed like a team on paper that should have been able to tear up the SK game. Like, they had more skill, arguably. They had a setup that was actually designed to draw out some of these. Now, yes, there was the whole Carrigan versus Fallen psychological component. There was the fact that the chemistry of the FaZe players wasn't as good. Think of that if you're an SK fan. FaZe Clan clearly had better individual players at the end of 2017, but what didn't they have? They didn't have this composure, they didn't have the same chemistry, they didn't have the same philosophy to how to play the game out. So the things that made SK better at times, especially head-to-head, wasn't having the better players. You are actually underselling and undervaluing your own team that you support if you think that they just had the better players and that's why they won. You don't actually appreciate what was amazing about what they were doing, which is what I'm hopefully elucidating to some degree in this video. Then you've got to add in that they had a very interesting aptitude for the map pool, because in 2016, I think that's one of the best maps, leading into ESO1 Cologne, that is one of the deepest, most impressive map pools I have ever seen, where as a result, they could match up with every single team in the top 10 favourably, where you would expect them to win, and that's why they won ESO1 Cologne in such dominant fashion, even coming out of that group of death, Group D. Then you look at 2017, what I loved about this is this really shows off some of the composure and the mental attitude that this team had and the clutch core that they had in the team. Because I actually think in 2017, the map pool was much, much worse. I think that's part of why they fell off when they got Phelps, and then they figured out some of the map pool and where to flex, so they went away from some of their old strengths. But what was great was when they really got rolling towards the end of the year with Bolts, one of the reasons why they could win those 3 out of 4 titles, and some of them in super clutch fashion, was because maps like Train and maps like Overpass, actually, they weren't the best team on. In fact, when they played against some of the FaZe lineups, I actually thought the FaZe lineups at times were better with, for example, with Nico on Train than SK was. I actually thought the FaZe lineup with Guardian and Olaf was better on Overpass than SK was. But in the head-to-head matchup, they could beat this team on these maps. They could get wins against teams like Astralis, who were fabulous on these maps, even though in theory those are better squads on those specific maps. So that clutch composure allowed you to steal wins, to grind wins out on maps that actually, in terms of like playing out the map and understanding all the strengths that you need to have on this specific map and where you put pressure and how to have a great deep playbook and what response, they weren't as good as past years, but they could get the wins there. So that in itself is impressive, that you're not godlike, but you can still be even the best teams on those maps sometimes. Then you look at the individual players they've had. My lord, when these players were at their peaks, clearly all their peaks were in the past at the moment, but they were fabulous. I mean, coldzera, 2016 was an amazing breakout year, so consistent, to be so good when you finally get to the finals and the semi-finals of majors and not need that ramp-up time that so many other players need. How can you not respect him? I mean, when we talk about coldzera, I talk about simple, I say like a prodigy, greatest skilled player ever, Olaf Meister, like most insane impact on the game, like defined his entire team's success. You know what I always say when I talk about coldzera? First of all, I give him that nickname, the Terminator. He just keeps coming. He's got this amazing mentality and ability to reset and never get onto an emotional level, to just grind you out with consistency. But more importantly, this guy is the master. He is someone who has mastered the game and his skill set and his lane, and within what he does, nobody is better at that than him, maybe ever. I mean, it reminds me to some degrees of the classic Get Right of late 2013, late 2012, the original NiP lineup, in terms of how amazing he was at what he did in his skill set, and that made him the best. Now, funnily enough, what do both players actually share as a quality? Incredible work ethic. Never being satisfied with what you've got. So absolutely, I'm a huge fan of coldzera in that particular sense. And in 2017, I'll go ahead and say it, I thought that when they lost some of that clutch quality and when they brought Phelps in, they lost what they'd had with FNX and they didn't have the same chemistry in map pool, I thought he actually was even better in 2017. For me, in 2017 was when he was the clear best player in the entire world and there wasn't much debate, whereas I thought there was times in 2016 where I thought Nico was actually a better individual player. Now, beyond that, we've got Fallen. Again, another player, this time who went the opposite way. 2016 was the year where he looked like he had the all-around game. He was both an amazing in-game leader, a lot more tactical at times then, but also leading the style and bringing up these newer players that all sometimes hadn't been in this position to win before, and having amazing AWPing. But I will say, I always thought it was a bit overrated to say he was like the best AWP. I thought he had times when he was, but it was the way he used the AWP that defined the tactical style and how they played the CT sides, and then what was possible for the team and creating advantages elsewhere for other people like FNX, like coldzera, to clean up. So I always thought he was a fabulous, fabulous player. 2017, I thought he had his problems at times in both respects. Sometimes as an in-game leader, obviously not as bad as this year. Sometimes as in terms of like raw firepower, sure, he had more firepower elsewhere in his team, so he was a little bit lost in the mix. Still an amazing clutch player, still one of the most baller mentalities I've ever seen, still a true winner in terms of his mentality and the way he approaches the game and thinks of the game himself. And that's one of the things I found very sad, actually, that while I think coldzera is still the master and still maintains an extremely high level this year, I do think Fallen's mentality got cracked a little bit. Now, some of that might be losing Taco. Some of that might be having to go with the other players and not get your first choice in terms of transfers. Some of that might be losing confidence because your main star coldzera came to you and said, I want to be the in-game leader. I want to do that instead of you. I think I can do that better than you. I don't think your style's the right style right now, metaphorically. That'll get to you. That'll sap your confidence. You see that right now with Carrigan and FaZe. He looks like a sad little puppy, like, oh, am I not going to get to be the in-game leader anymore? And you don't see him really coming back from that. So it's depressing, but it also, again, makes me look back on past years and thinks how fucking amazing was what this guy was able to do for 2 years. Then you look at someone like Fur. Fur is a player where, in terms of work ethic, I have my qualms about him. I don't blame people for who they are. I don't demand they do more. But when I look at what he is, what a fucking boss this guy is. That's what I would describe Fur as. He is a boss. He is a baller. What a fucking G. What a pimp. Because this is a guy who just, he is just him. He just does him. He doesn't give a fuck what you think. And he's one of the few players I've ever seen in Counter-Strike I actually do think is fearless. Actually do think doesn't care what you think. I even think sometimes in his squads didn't care what his teammates thought, was just going to play his style anyway. What I love is, first of all, in 2016, he did seem to sacrifice. He did seem to allow people like Fallen and coldzera to be more the prominent figures in the team, and he was just another player in the squad, but didn't need that star attention. He had the trophies. Why the fuck would he need the attention? Then when he came into his own, my God, in 2017, there were times where, in terms of like actual tournaments, I thought sometimes he was just cursed to have played with coldzera, because I actually think if you'd put him on a different squad and they both played in the same tournament, there would have been times where he would have been the MVP on a different type of team. The problem is coldzera wins the clutches. They're all in your mind. coldzera has the consistency and the efficiency, so the numbers look better. For what he was doing and the style he was playing, Fur was doing some impossible shit at times in 2017. I actually always felt like there's a what if with Fur's career, which is that as I was saying that, I don't think he fit the core of SK in the same sense, or he wasn't part of the core that informed the overall style. I've always felt like he himself, at his best and how he likes to play, is more aligned with the vision of what the Immortals core was doing for most of their history. Like a very aggressive, free-flowing style, taking a lot of peaks, using your raw ability, playing the up-tempo game, playing like what I've often described as like Samba Counter-Strike, because that's what came out of Brazil originally, before people brought tactical elements to the game, and you had the slower-paced Kogu, AWPing style that dominated from the mid-2000s. This is a guy where if you'd have made him the best player in Immortals, he would have been the superstar. He would have been one of the absolute best players in the entire world. We would be raving about this guy up there with Nico and coldzera and Simple in a way that we didn't really often, even in 2017. And quite frankly, he could have been the superstar player they needed, the aggressive player they needed, the leader by like raw example and by like, just follow me, I'm fierce. I don't give a fuck what these guys are going to do. And also, a side element is, I don't think it's just banter in interviews. I think he legitimately would be motivated to beat Fallen and coldzera. And even if Immortals might not have been better than them, I can't really know, it's hard to speculate, I think he would have made them a really hype matchup against them. And I think against a lot of other teams in the world, it would have been fucking straight fire when his team could have gone against them. Then you look at someone like FNX, a guy I have a lot of respect for his career, as I pointed out. I really go into more detail on that there. Very good clutch player, good game sense, at times had a stable mentality. Unfortunately, outside of the game, a lot of distractions, himself a distraction at times, something of a divisive figure, didn't have the same work ethic. But for what he was, and in his prime, for like, let's say, the first 8 or so months of his time in the team. Very legit and a key piece that is never going to be touted as the best player and certainly shouldn't be on a top ranking list. But what he brought to the team is a value that you can only see when you look at the overall picture. When he talked to his teammates about what he was doing, what he brought to the squad, and how he helped affect some of the clutch culture that they had. And I don't think their chemistry was ever as good when he left, quite frankly, even though he probably had some effect on ruining outside of the game chemistry. Taco's a player where when he first joined the team, I remember just thinking, what the fuck have they done this? This guy is terrible. I watched his game. He was dog shit in terms of aim. His raw skills looked like he really suffered. I also thought when you looked at him that he looked like a guy who'd been given the call up to the bigger squad, a massive international team. And because the team had gotten so much better immediately than they would have thought, there wasn't the gradual build up, that he seemed out of his depth, out of his element. I thought this guy is going to he's going to sink. He's not going to make it. He's not going to be able to survive in a squad like this. And he's going to get cut. And they're going to bring in Bolts, or they're going to bring in someone Lucas from Immortals. They're going to bring in one of these players and try them out instead. No, that's not what happened at all. This is a guy who very quickly found his role, was willing to listen to the others and have them tell him how to play the game, was willing to learn from Fallen Coldzera how he could play best to help everyone else in the team. And as a result, by the time you get to the end of his time with SK, and now when he's in Team Liquid, rightfully hailed as one of the great support players, rightfully hailed as someone who can be a key piece in your team, can do a lot of the dirty jobs, which make it easier for the stars to shine and look like they're the ones winning the game. And with him, I've always said this, he doesn't need any props, he doesn't need any plaudits. They're nice if he gets them, I'm sure it makes him feel good. He can always say to anyone who talks shit to him, look at my trophy cabinet. And then they can go, yeah, but you had calls. It's like, no, just look at all those trophies. I was a part of that. Now, was I the biggest part? Hey, you can debate that all you like, but I was a part of that. You can't take that away from me. So his success, you cannot deny. What a fabulous mentality for the game as well, and work ethic. And in his own ways, sure, he banters publicly. Sure, he can seem cocky publicly because sometimes he wants to bring that element in the showmanship. But in his own way, at times, has been quite a humble player, has been someone who's been willing to accept that he couldn't just do things the way he wanted, to adapt himself to the team. And as a result, wasn't like the most important player, but without him, without that little element to the team, would they have been as good? I don't think they would. I can't think of many players who would have replaced him and made them that type of a team, that same quality of being a clutch squad. Then let's talk about some of the ones that were briefly there, right? So you had Phelps. He came in a time when the team was in trouble. They were in crisis. They weren't as good a team. They hadn't won a tournament in many, many months. It was a different meta. Virtus Pro was on top. Astralis was on top. And later the FaZe clan with Nico came along. They needed to change up what they were doing. And so one of the ways they did it is they took a gamble on Phelps. And even though they couldn't give him a direct starring role, those were taken by Coldzera and Fur, he still could be a contributing element of that. And he could still have some space within the team, even though he didn't have full freedom. And because they had such amazing players in Coldzera and in Fur, he could then contribute and give them some serious firepower. So then they were a squad that all of a sudden, unlike the year before, was out fragging people. Like, they were just a team that had raw ability above the level of many of the teams in the world and go head to head even with teams like FaZe Clan. Astralis is probably like an even match overall in that sense. So I always thought that was something very, very respectable. It didn't hold on for that long. I think people definitely blamed him too much when he left. Other elements of the team had also fallen off, and it's just that he was a bit of a delayed reaction before it all went to shit. But he was a part of some very good lineups, some very good results rather, and could even have won a major with them. Finally, let's talk about Bolts. As I alluded to before, when he was in Immortals, he was not always the best player. He wasn't always like a standout player that you had to recruit. When they got into this position where they brought him into SK, I can see why they did it. It was trying to kind of like a transition back to the 2016 style of the lineup, which, okay, it worked initially, then it dropped off hard. They weren't able, perhaps outside of the game, to make this guy feel as comfortable. His in-game suffered. That can happen. Sadly, it was a bit of a sour ending, quite frankly. I feel like he was done a little bit dirty. It was that thing where it's like, you know you're going to cut the guy, but then you also sort of leave him on an island. You don't relieve any of the pressure. You let him fail. Then when he fails, you go, sorry, mate, see ya, you're out the door. So that was a bit rough, but he had his little brief period. And for a player who'd been in Immortals and hadn't won big trophies, he got to win some massive trophies. He got to briefly be hailed as a great addition to the team, and people were loving him at the end of 2017. Now, the thing about this team is, could it have even kept going? I mean, 2 full years of being really good is fucking legit. There's not many squads in history, not many cores in history have ever accomplished that. So to actually ask for more is almost a bit greedy. But we want to see if it's possible, right? Well, first of all, if FNX hadn't have imploded, I do think that team was still right there for the latter half of 2016. They were so close to winning championships. It's just that certain elements started to slightly degrade. Certain elements of the chemistry slightly went off. Certain people didn't keep their form up as much. So if FNX hadn't imploded personally, I certainly think that they could have kept being a very good team. They could have maybe extended it and won more championships, maybe even coming in 2017 and being absolutely one of the very best teams with FNX in the lineup. He was a strong stabilising force in terms of his game style. He had good game sense overall. He had confidence against some of the best players. He wasn't somebody who needed to overcome mental issues in terms of facing certain key opponents that are better than you in the game. There's also the factor that outside of the team, if KNG hadn't imploded with all the social media farces and all the stupid things that he did, I think this is a guy who might have actually been considered instead of a Tarek or a Stuart UK. And if you'd have brought him in, especially when Fallen was suffering with his AWP, he could have been a secondary AWPer. He could have been an AWP factor in your team as a hybrid. He's a very aggressive, very confident player. I don't think it would have lasted very long. I think his character flaws would always have gotten to him in the end, and he would have been an accelerated FNX in that sense. But you could have had a very fiery, potentially brilliant 3 to 6 months if you could have had this guy in the squad. That's another way you could have updated the team. And the final aspect is, let's say there was a world in which Fer decides, either I retire, I'm just sick of it in 2017, or he goes and joins in Immortals. You do the swap. Phelps comes in and you give him the Fer positions, and you build him up to be the future Fer, to be the strong, powerful, aggressive player, very, very strong aiming rifler. I actually think in terms of raw individual skill, I might even say he's more talented than Fer, because I think Fer got a lot out of his game, but I think Phelps had a lot more to show, quite frankly. And now there are some mentality issues with him and some work ethic issues with him that weren't as simple and didn't always come out. I know he seems like a very quiet guy, but he has his own stubbornness to him. So there's another aspect that could have kept it going, could have made them even greater than they were. But let's be real. These are still two of the best lineups to ever play Counter-Strike. These were fabulous lineups to watch, and these were some that gave us some absolutely amazing Counter-Strike. So even though we don't have that core anymore, even though it's a very different squad, and if MiBR gets to the top, it'll be in a very different way under Yanko and with the American players or with different players in the future, who can't look back and appreciate how fucking amazing this squad was? This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, James Harding, Daniel Yordanov, VeXii, Robert Baxter, and a special thanks goes out as always to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Would you fancy a few teasers for what's coming up in my content? How about taking part in an esports discussion with me? Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.